So, E3 happened, and if there's one thing that's really annoyed me this E3, it's actually been the general reaction to VR this time. I mean, I've seen some negativity towards VR, but now people just seem aggressive with their virtual reality hate. They're like, why is there this VR? VR is stupid, it's over, it's done, it's a gimmick, it's dead. And, like, it's surprising to me, because even people who liked VR when they were playing it have suddenly flipped to this. Like, this is the common narrative now amongst gamers. Just, it's common knowledge that VR is a dumb gimmick that doesn't go anywhere. It's common knowledge that there's no good VR games. Like, people, it is a cliche to say, oh wow, a bad VR game, who would have thunk? And it blows my mind, because again, people who were previously enjoying VR are behaving like this out of nowhere because they've gotten caught up into this stupid narrative. And wouldn't you friggin' know it, but a stupid video called The Death of the PSVR showed up on my YouTube feed from Mashable. Which, before we go on, there's one thing I really need to address here.
Who wants to party with the Switch? 2.7 million units in the first month, baby.
Controllers for everyone!
Okay, this is the biggest lie. I love my Nintendo Switch, but controllers for everyone? Do you know how much those controllers cost? Those are $95 controllers. No joke, the controller that comes with your Nintendo Switch, $95. Each half of a controller costs $40, and then the holder costs $15. In fact, the Pro controller is $70. Thankfully, 8BitDo and Hori are producing some lower price controllers, but egad, you want to talk about the biggest screw up Nintendo's made. All their advertisements for the Switch have been about, oh, look, you can play with friends, local multiplayer, bring it everywhere, give everyone a controller. But you can't. The controllers are just too stupidly expensive. Like, in fact, when you think about it, a Nintendo Switch with 2 controllers costs the same as a PlayStation VR. It's kind of funny. Now, again, I love the Nintendo Switch. It is a fantastic concept, a dream come true in many cases, and I can't wait to pick up ARMS tomorrow. But let's reel ourselves in here. The PlayStation VR is not a flop. It's so weird that people behave that way when they're showing VR games at E3, and Sony themselves have said that they're going to restart advertising. See, that's the thing. The reason why you haven't seen a lot of ads is it seems like Sony swept the PlayStation VR under the rug. That's because they ran out of them. Like, around Christmas, the PlayStation VR was selling out everywhere. It was very hard to get. It has sold 1.5 million units, and due to the complex nature of the VR headset, production of them has been rather slow. So I think that's given a lot of people this illusion that the VR is doing badly and that it's not carried in stores. No, it's carried. It's just hard to keep them on store shelves because there is a demand. And it's a demand that makes perfect sense because the PlayStation VR is the cheapest VR headset. And people heard a lot about VR. They want to try it out. And they'd like a real VR headset that isn't just strapping a cell phone to your face. The PlayStation VR is that. It is the cheapest, simplest, easiest VR headset. It's not the best. The best is the Oculus Rift. All the PC ones are way better because you set up multiple sensors all over the place. They have a bunch of different markers on the controllers to make them easy to track. And the PlayStation VR, it's just, okay, there's a camera in front of you, and there's a bunch of lights all around you, and it tracks the lights. It is the cheapest VR solution. But it's also the easiest, because you don't have to worry about, oh, can my PC run this? How do I hook this up? How do I install the hardware? No. You plug it into your PS4. I mean, yes, it has the breakout box, which has, and it's a little more complex with that because it has its own power supply, and you plug the USB into your PS4 and the HDMI from your PS4 into the box, then another HDMI from the box to your TV. Yeah, there is that, but that's not anywhere near as complex and overwhelming as literally any other VR headset. And so that, yeah, it's the easiest way to hop into VR and try it out. So yes, it's selling very well. On top of the fact that, again, it's got Resident Evil 7 on it. That's a big name game to try. And you can see some of the bigger, bolder VR games coming to it, though a lot of the smaller ones are having a hard time getting themselves over there. I think a lot of the VR backlash, though, comes from how things started, really. Because for 5 years almost, when the Oculus Rift was in development, oh, egad, people wouldn't shut up about VR. I remember this. Just every news outlet, anytime anything happened with the Oculus Rift, they'd rave about it. This is the future of gaming. VR is amazing. Even the nausea, they made a big deal about how amazing it was because it was just too real. And the thing with the Oculus Rift was that it was kind of crowdfunded. And the idea was, hey, it's been 2 decades since we last tried VR. Surely we can do it cheaper and better now. So people thought they were going to get a $200 headset that worked on everything. And that was kind of the way it was. Everyone was supporting it. Oh yeah, the VR is going to be on anything that accepts it. And they were all behind it. Then, now this is the depressing thing. One of the lead programmers behind the Oculus Rift got mugged and shot in an alley. Yeah, that was kind of the event that broke all this. And it's the kind of thing that really makes you reflect on, I don't know, on just how bad, just what a crime death is. Because people die all around us every day and we don't think about it. We've been desensitized to it. But in this case, this is a person who spent most of their life learning and training and gaining a unique set of skills and abilities that only they had. They were like a freaking genius, okay? And they were working on this project that was going to revolutionize gaming, and it looked really promising. And then just one day, bullet takes him out. He's dead. Guy who shot him probably didn't even know who he was. Just, take the money and run. And you just think about how much we've all lost from that. It's really sad. Not to stay depressed, though, but yeah, that's... Shortly after that was when the Oculus Rift got bought out by Facebook. And that's the problem. See, everyone was on board with supporting the Oculus Rift when it was this little indie company and they looked like big heroes for backing that horse. But now that it's Facebook, now that Facebook is going to be making buku bucks off of Microsoft and Sony and everyone. Oh, well, now everyone closed their door. Now everyone starts making their own VR headsets. And then news comes out that the Oculus Rift is $600. And then, after that, the HTC Vive hits the market. First VR headset to hit the market in 2 decades. And it's $1,000, but it is the best tracking one. And all the freaking game journalists rush out to buy one and hop into VR, and they don't realize, wait a second, HTC doesn't make games. So they hook this all up, and they get in, oh yeah, VR's gonna be amazing, and all they have is a bunch of crappy, overpriced tech demos made by tiny indie devs. And they're like, wow, that was really underwhelming. And then, since the HTC Vive hit so early, for the first couple months, nothing was coming out on it, because no one had a VR headset. Who's gonna back development of VR games for the HTC Vive at that point? It's too new. And so people, they're sitting there like, all I can do with my VR headset is play Space Pirate Trainer. And so this thing, it just leaves such a terrible first impression. And so everyone hears the only things in VR are a bunch of gimmicky minigame collections. There are no real games. Nothing's coming out for it. It was a stupid gimmick. And on one hand, people are pissed off because for 5 years we heard about how VR is just the most amazing thing ever, and then these journalists get their hands on it and, oh yeah, no, that's just not. Really? On top of that, there's the price, though. That's the big problem. When people see VR games, they're like, I don't want to pay $400 to like that. They actively try not to like it. They're like, I don't want to fall in love with a VR game because I don't want to go out and pay $400 to take a risk on this game. And I can't blame them there. 'Cause, yeah, it's pricey. $400 is a lot of money. And, you're taking a risk. People don't want to pay that much until there's a game that justifies a $400 price tag. And no one is going to make that game and make it VR exclusive. Some people would argue that Resident Evil 7 fit that bill, but it wasn't VR exclusive. Most people played it outside of VR, and it was fine, it was great, they loved it, they don't need a VR headset. What they need is something that really shows what VR can do, and this is one of the other problems, is that you can't get across how amazing VR is on a flat TV. You really have to experience it for yourself, because all you see is a partially tilted, shaky camera and a guy dancing around with glow sticks looking like an idiot. The person in there, though, is having their minds blown. But the main thing a lot of people look at is like, it's just, it's games in first person. We can do that without VR. We don't need VR. What does VR add to this? Because I've had conversations about this with people who have never played VR, and they look at it and they go, what does VR add? What does VR do? Well, the best way to describe it is like a big screen TV. What does a big screen TV add? What does a big screen TV do for a game? Nothing, but people still want it. They want to see a bigger image. They want to be more up close. Well, VR, the best way to describe it is that it is an infinite inch screen TV. Because your entire environment, everything around you, everything you can see is now game. You look left, there's game. You look right, there's game. Your peripheral vision, all game. And it's in 3D. And this is another one of those hiccups. Because people hear, oh geez, 3D. 3D's such a gimmick, it gives me a headache, I can't stand it. No. 3D in VR is different, because regular 3D, you're looking at a flat screen. It is a single angle. It is a single displayed image. But when you replace your 3D real world with a view of a 3D virtual world, the effect is just crazy. Like, it's so hard to describe, but 3D has so much more of an impact when you can look around an object and move around the 3D space while looking in 3D, and you look to the left and you look to the right, and it's just all 3D everywhere. It's crazy. And it's such a hard experience to describe. And now, like, initially I was like, VR is cool. I could see it evolving more, but I don't see this as being the future of gaming. That's how I felt before, like, when I first got it. But the more time I've spent in VR, the more I'm like, no, this is the future of gaming. Like, TV screen and controller isn't going away. But VR is absolutely going to become an option, I think, in the next generation of consoles. Like, I really think if we get another console generation, because things are kind of iffy right now, but if we get another console generation, I expect it to have built-in VR support for all 3D games. Like, as a system-level function of, you can move your head and look around in every game we release on the system. And I know a lot of people, they hear that, they go, what, even games that don't need VR, even games where it would be pointless? Yes, absolutely. Because there have been games that really didn't need VR, that you play them in VR and it enhances the experience. Robo Rescue, which is a free download, is one of the best examples. Everyone's been demanding more of that. It's a 3D platformer in VR, and it's played in third person. You're like this big overlooking robot, and you're remote controlling this little robot. It literally feels like you're playing with a toy. It's kind of incredibly cool and awesome, just having this little toy running around you. And it's more than that. Like, the most extreme and best example of something where VR is utterly pointless, but I'm loving it, is a game called Steel Combat. It is a 2D fighter in VR. But it's still really cool seeing that 2D fighter in VR around you and being able to immerse yourself in the environment. I'd totally buy it if it wasn't ridiculously overpriced. And there's also one other flaw, and this shows why regular TV screen-based play will never go away as well. There's no local multiplayer in Steel Combat, because the VR headset is only one person, so you gotta play online. And I think that if Steel Combat let you play on a regular TV, 2-player local, but also supported a 3D VR headset as well, it would be way cooler, and I probably would have actually paid the $40 to buy the game. As it stands right now, I'm waiting for it to drop to $20. Then I'll totally buy it. It's a good game. I've got a demo. There's a demo, but the demo's great. I'm good with that until I get a price drop on Steel Combat. But I've played a lot of games that don't need VR, but the effect does enhance it. So yeah, I really think VR has a lot of potential. And believe it or not, there are a lot of people who really love it. I mean, really, really love it. I highly recommend checking out the PlayStation VR subreddit, and you'll find some very interesting stories there. Like, there are actually some people who can't enjoy regular non-VR games anymore because they're so smitten with what VR provided them with. It was just so cool and overwhelming. And the big problem is that so much of VR and its terminology has been abused, like immersive. This is one of the common arguments I hear. VR is more immersive. Well, when you get into a game on a regular TV, it's immersive too. You don't need a big expensive headset to be immersed. Yeah, but the immersion you get in VR, kind of an entirely different thing. Like, this isn't just, I'm really absorbed in this game. This is, oh my crap, my entire world has been replaced with a digital facsimile of another world. It's being, as they always say, inside of the game. It's a really surreal, crazy experience, especially when you start getting into the games that's like replace your body with a different body, and that gives just, that's some weird feelings right there. I mean, it's really nuts. VR is an experience that you really have to experience for yourself. Like, you can't just look at it on a TV or hear someone rave about it. You gotta spend some time with it. And I think that's where a lot of the hiccups are, because from a casual observer's standpoint, VR doesn't seem like that big of a deal. It's once you're in there that you realize this is something different. Of course, there's more layers to me loving VR. Let's just be honest here. I love the PlayStation VR because it gives the PlayStation Move a second chance. The second chance it deserves. See, the Wiimote and Kinect waggle motion control was trash garbage. It just plain was. Because that wasn't motion control. That was just replacing button presses with inaccurate gestures. And that didn't work. The PlayStation Move was the only one that actually tracked your controller one-to-one. But it did so poorly that there were no really good Move games. It was just me playing Gladiator Duel and Sports Champions over and over again and wishing that someone would do more. But with VR, well, VR is kind of the evolution of motion control. I mean, it has motion tracking by default. The VR headset has to be tracked, how it moves, what its position is. So the headset is motion tracked, and then you get these controllers, and all the controllers are basically evolutions of the PlayStation Move. They're all built off the same basic concepts and principles as the Move. They're pretty much just evolutions of the Move. The difference is, like with the Vive controller, is that it has more markers and more cameras, which leads to better tracking compared to the Move, where it's just a glowy ball and a camera, right? So, but they all provide that same kind of actual motion tracking motion control, and this could provide the evolution of motion control that I always wanted, on top of the fact that motion control is just better in VR. This was something I hadn't taken into account. But when you're in VR, you actually see the sword and the hand and all that in its proper 3D space. Like, when you're doing sword combat with motion control, you're like, okay, this stick in my hand represents that sword on screen. It's like puppeteering. But in VR, you look at where your hand is in physical space, and there's a floating sword there, perfectly mimicking the movements that your hand is making. And that gives you way better spatial awareness and helps you really understand, okay, this is how I swing the sword, this is how I aim it. It makes everything make much more sense. Like, you can just be more accurate because you have that better spatial awareness. And it's the second chance that motion control really, really deserves. And so that is admittedly part of why I like it. Because it's not stupid, gimmicky BS anymore. It's real, legitimate, accurate, one-to-one motion-based control. All these things just really add up. Now, unfortunately, though, I still hesitate to recommend the PlayStation VR. Because the biggest problem is still that price tag. $400 is a lot of money. And that's the cheapest one. That's the cheapest headset. And that's assuming you already have the camera. But yeah, no, $400 is a lot to pay for a headset. $500 is a lot to pay for a headset. It's more than the price of your system. Although that does remind me, before we go, I need to clear this up. You don't need a PlayStation 4 Pro. This is one of the most pernicious lies about the PlayStation VR out there. I hate the PS4 Pro. I don't own one. I'm loving the PlayStation VR. I use a regular PS4. I don't intend to get a Pro. Because the Pro was such a minor upgrade to the regular PlayStation 4 that a lot of people wondered what the point even was, and they just assumed it was PlayStation VR. Yes, it'll display PlayStation VR games at a higher resolution in a lot of cases, and you might get a few more particle effects. But no VR game requires the PS4 Pro. And 60 FPS is required for a PlayStation VR game. You can't get away from that. And as such, the Pro really isn't necessary. But that's the thing, is when people talk about the PlayStation VR, they're always like, oh, and I gotta get a PlayStation 4 Pro too, so it winds up being $800 anyway. No, it doesn't. You don't need a Pro. And as for the games coming out on it, that's another thing I think a lot of people don't realize. Almost every week, Sony has made sure at least one new PlayStation VR game comes out. There's been a few weeks they've skipped, but in general, they keep delivering PlayStation VR games. They keep coming, which I'm glad about, because I like the PlayStation VR. And yes, we're talking about downloadable mini-games most of the time, but I don't even want to say mini-games. You know, sometimes they are pretty fleshed out. But yeah, it's frustrating, because no one really knows about what's really going on with the PlayStation VR. And this has actually led to something really peculiar. The VR community, because there is now a cult fan base for VR, because it is such an engrossing and different experience. But since regular outlets aren't giving VR the time of day, like IGN outright removed their PlayStation VR section, what this meant is that the VR community is kind of breaking off from the regular gaming community. There are special, separate, VR-only review and news sites floating around out there, like Upload VR, that are absolutely necessary, because, yeah, regular gaming media doesn't give VR the time of day it deserves. And it is also important to know we're still in the early days of VR. You know, you could say that the whole concept of VR has been rebooted. So few people played it 20 years ago that we didn't really get a standard established. And now that we're doing VR again, we're starting over. We're starting fresh. There's been just such a gap of time, and we're still learning what works and doesn't work in VR, how best to minimize nausea, what game concepts can be done, how things can be evolved, how to work the controls. We're still learning that. And I think a lot of the people who are loving VR have said that they're well aware that they are getting on at the ground floor of something revolutionary, and that they know that baby steps have to be made. So that's part of why I wouldn't entirely recommend the PlayStation VR unless you really have money to throw around. Because even the lowest price VR is still rather expensive. There's a few good games to play on it, but nothing that I would describe as just mind-blowingly great. This is why VR exists. The closest to that for me is Mortal Blitz, okay? And that game has about 3 different, like, actual environments. You do train lab, missile silo. But I still, oh my god, I love that game. And no one talks about that game. Good example. So I wouldn't say everyone rush out and get VR, but I would say, this is going to become a thing. And I'm so glad that there's enough people who are so fascinated and intrigued by what VR could be that they're buying PlayStation VRs and the games on it and lining up, and it's not a complete money sink for developers yet. That something could grow here. Because, of course, if no one buys into VR now, then, VR just gets scrapped and it never evolves, and the price of headsets never drops, and we never get to go further with it. That's the funniest thing, the punchline. I looked at the prices of old VR headsets, and guess what? Most of them, like, the lowest priced ones were about $500, $600 back in the early 90s. So VR headset prices haven't actually dropped because, again, they were only there for a moment and then they vanished. They didn't have time for the technology to evolve and get cheaper and get more affordable. It needs people who are supporting it. And I'm all about that because I'm loving my virtual reality experience, but I understand that it's a tricky proposition. But, again, my big thing that I want to say is that calling the PlayStation VR dead is dumb. Virtual reality is way better than people make it out to be. And while I wouldn't recommend it to the masses yet, it is something we all need to keep our eyes on and see how it evolves. And definitely it's something I think should be nurtured and should grow. Anyway, that's been a rant. Hope you enjoyed. See you later.